Most unlikely of villains, smooths of brain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it boggle? Does it meow? In the lair of the cerebral bore, and will show him so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. I'm your host, Jason from Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Joining me today is one of our regulars, Carl Rodriguez, the Geomologist Presents. How are you doing today, Carl?
I'm doing pretty good.
Excellent. And we have some returning guests. We have Todd of the Hex Press.
Hello, hello. How is everybody doing today?
Great. I'm glad you could join us today. And of course, we have Media Baron Daniel Norton of Bandits Keep.
Hey there.
So today we're going to kind of talk about tools to build dungeons / mega dungeons. And then this is actually a special episode. This is a combined effort with Todd because the Hex Press YouTube channel. What'll happen is we're going to discuss tools and ideas in this episode. And then Todd is going to stream the building of part of a dungeon. So that's going to be cool. Now, these will be shown at a sequence course because Todd's video is going to be live on the 18th of October, and you're not going to hear this audio portion until the 21st of October, Friday. So this will be a few days afterwards, but that's okay.
Yeah,
Absolutely okay.
So I guess the first thing we have to do is define what a dungeon is, and part of that is going to be also what a mega dungeon is. Is a mega dungeon just a big dungeon? Are they different things? So I guess let's start with the easy one. As far as gaming goes, as opposed to torture in the Middle Ages, what is, or torture in modern day, I guess, depending what part of the world you live in, what is a dungeon as far as D&D goes? Who wants to field that?
Toss it to Daniel. We already know he's got strong opinions.
Yeah, he's got strong opinions.
Let him get him out of the way first.
All right, I will have a strong opinion. So a dungeon is, so I like to use two different terms. I like to use location, adventure location, and dungeon. A dungeon to me is very specifically an underground, generally, location that is infested by some kind of monster or evil. It could be a spirit, that kind of thing. I don't buy into this was second edition. I forget the designer now. The idea that like things need to make sense. Like dungeons don't make sense. If it's a temple that's sitting on the ground, that's not a dungeon to me. That's a location. If it's a weird space underground that people have dug out and now they're worshiping Cthulhu behind some secret door and there's gray ooze dripping from the ceiling, that's a dungeon.
I think it's fair. And any other opinions? I think the dungeon part I think is pretty straightforward, but definitely we'll throw it open in case anybody has any twists on that.
Well,
No, I think it's
so
good.
you think that I was going to ask Daniel, you think the dungeon has to necessarily be random? There can't be, like, I would say, logical dungeon ecology?
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah. I don't think it has to be random, but I don't think you have to know what the point was. Because I know a lot of people dig into this whole, like, why was this originally built? I dig into
Nope, Daniel, your signal's dropping.
And
Yeah.
I guess Zoom hates me.
There you go.
Well, what's that?
You were digging in. We lost. You said you were digging into, but I think I tend to agree. I mean, I agree with you that it doesn't. Why the dungeon is there doesn't really matter, right?
Right.
But I think that I don't think things should just be sitting on their hands waiting for player characters to arrive, right? There's a dynamic in a dungeon, right? And I think the better dungeons, some of the classic dungeons, that are kind of based on that. There's like, wandering monsters make sense, right? Why they're wandering, why and there could be there's groups in there vying for control of the dungeon, in spite of the player characters being there. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's just
right.
like that.
I feel like
when
that's
we
an
get
option,
to the actual dungeon design, I think that's a consideration. But I think I don't.
Yeah.
I've never really liked, but I feel like I can't think. Most of the dungeons that I've come across aren't. Sometimes there seems some odd elements that I don't know why they're there, but to even the Caves of Chaos and Keep on the Borderlands there's some idea and organization, whether the players figure it out or not, to it, right? So.
Right. Or also whether the game master knows. I'm not a fan of things that are set in stone. Like, I don't like the idea that, like, well, these guys go on this patrol here and there. I don't buy into the sitting on their hands thing. I think that, like, whenever you encounter something, it was doing something and you just happen. So if the room says there's 5 orcs in here, it's not like they've been sitting in there waiting for adventurers. They could have just got there. They might be doing any number of things, but people look at that and they see, oh, a room just says 5 orcs. So they must be sitting there in stasis, but that's not the case. It just means they're there when the adventurers arrive. That's a story point, I guess, is the way I would look at that.
I think the stasis part just simply comes in because we read them as they're written, right? And it just says 5 orcs. And to be fair, especially probably with modern ones too, I haven't done some comparison, especially with the old school ones. Like, I just looked at the Caves of Chaos yesterday on stream for a quick minute, and it'll have a room and it'll just say 5 goblins are here. And it doesn't say what they're doing. And sure, in the moment, we're supposed to take that and then imagine, well, what are they actually doing? But it is very easy, kind of given the material, to end up with just 5 orcs are in the room, as opposed to they're playing cards, or they're getting undressed, or they're changing, or they're in flux, things like that, right? But I mean, that's more on the GMs and how we're running the dungeon than the dungeons themselves.
Right. Like, I'd much rather have a dungeon that just had a bunch of stuff listed than one that has all kinds of detail about what everybody's doing, unless it's relevant to something else. If it makes a difference, like these goblins are filling up sacks of coal because they're going to bring it down to, there's an engine deeper in the dungeon run by a wizard, and that's why they're here, because they're getting this coal. That makes sense. If there's just goblins in a room, they could be there for any reason. And I actually like creating my own reasons, because my adventuring group has their own reasons to be in the dungeon, right? So the person writing this thing has their reasons, but like my group might not be full. I almost never use the standard hook, right? I always insert dungeons the way I want them. So I don't care about that coal, maybe. So I might take that out. So that's just the way I run. But I mean, obviously, different people run different ways. And this is when we get into the MegaDungeon. This is where this will become much more relevant.
Yeah.
Well, I think for the most part, Todd, unless you have anything to interject with the dungeon part, I think maybe we jump ahead there to that now, because.
Well, I'm going to actually steal a quote from Todd, because I thought he actually said something really great, which I don't 100% agree with, but I like the beginning of it, which is he was just talking about the difference between MegaDungeons and dungeons. And he said a dungeon is like for an adventure, where a MegaDungeon is for a campaign. And I think that's a good way to think about it. And, not that a dungeon or a location, usually a dungeon is a 1 or 2 adventures, it's a small space. It's a goblin's lair. It's a old temple. That's like a dungeon. I mean, of course, I would consider a temple a location, as I just said, but that's what that works out. Something that's a MegaDungeon is more long-term, right? It's meant to be re-explored.
Yeah, I think that was a great point that Todd put in our Discord, our pre-game Discord that we're talking and discussing this. So I don't know. Is there a question I would have then, if we're defining dungeon versus MegaDungeon, because you have the 3-room dungeon, these little type of thing, but a MegaDungeon, I mean, it's, I guess the name, it sounds like it has to have lots of space, lots of rooms, right? So on top of it being a campaign, something that you're going to go back to again and again, then it's going to be big. It's going to have
So
100. I don't know if there's a lower cap limit. Like, is it less than 100 is a regular dungeon, more than 100 is a MegaDungeon? But
and I'm curious, because of course I don't do any research, and I expect Jason to know everything. When the term MegaDungeon actually first appeared,
I know that's a good question.
Because when I think when most people think of a MegaDungeon, if you roll all the ways back to the 3rd book in OD&D, right? He's describing this dungeon with the multiple levels and everything. That is what most people imagine when they think of a MegaDungeon, but he doesn't call it a MegaDungeon. And I think that's important, right? So maybe the term MegaDungeon has become to mean big, but I don't take it necessarily as that. I mean, bigger than 5 rooms for sure. But I see Todd's. That's so cute how it is, a little thing.
Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah. So what I mentioned, I actually put a video out kind of in anticipation of these 2 streams. I rattled one off, going a little bit more detail, though not much, on my kind of mega dungeon versus dungeon thing. But I think one of the things that I think about is, in some ways, it's almost like a mega dungeon is almost a Russian doll kind of other dungeons, or because, and it actually goes back to what I think before we started recording, or I don't know if you have in the record, when Daniel was talking about this one tool, this kind of deck of dungeons, right? If you think about kind of in the classic sense, and then kind of what we're talking about, if a level of Castle Greyhawk was like one of those deck of dungeons thing, right? It was one kind of theme, one sort of thing. You know, his were all kind of, could be crazy, could be a giant's bowling alley, could be they're filled another level filled with dragons or something like that. I think often a lot of those almost equate to, in a sense, that their own dungeons. And then as you're kind of stacking these dungeons, each dungeon might have its own theme, which I think, especially in the modern sense, right? We like to think of, well, what's the theme of this particular dungeon? Then a mega dungeon is basically having multiple dungeons of these themes kind of next to each other, right? You think of something like, even like, it's not, I would call it a mega dungeon, but maybe it's not a huge one, kind of a Caverns of Thracia sort of thing, where depending on what level you're on, you're really in kind of a different environment. At the bottom, it's this almost like a center of the earth kind of thing, where it's got its own ecology, and then another level has this part, another level has this other part, right? Where they have that real differentiation thematically between levels. And I think that's kind of where bridging maybe the old school one, which, like as Daniel said, they just called them dungeons, but that kind of, maybe we could say, well, now we maybe call them closer to funhouse dungeon. But in the way you have these different thematic kind of elements that are put together, and while inside each theme may it should all kind of work together, but with the mega dungeon, we're kind of connecting these different themes together and trying to figure out how do we make them fit.
Right.
Daniel?
No, I agree 100%. See how I did that seamlessly, Jason? You didn't have to tell me, but then you you killed the flow, people listening. We had a flow. We have an on deck thing going on. This is how you should run initiative, by the way, in later initiatives. Anyways, so I have three things written down to me that make a mega dungeon. One is the word underworld. And I think if we think of underworld is all kinds of craziness depending on what cultures we tap into. And D&D is a mix of cultures, right? Unpredictable. You don't know what's going to be on the next level necessarily. It could be some weird slide drops you down into a room of elementals where on the floor before it was freezing cold. Now it's on fire, right? And it's the dungeon itself is a puzzle. Trying to solve the dungeon with the ways to go up and down, figuring out factions, things like that. That's part of the mega dungeon. The whole thing is a puzzle the players are trying to work out. So yeah, that's what I think.
Yes, I did look it up while you guys were talking about Mega Dungeon and the origins, and it does. I guess you are right, Daniel. The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures from '74 is where the idea of these giant dungeons came about, right? So OD&D, but then it was, I guess, Mega Dungeon and Super Dungeon. The terms were first used in 1991 when they described Undermountain, the big dungeon underneath Waterdeep and the Forgotten Realms, and they call it a super dungeon though. And it wasn't until the 2000 where someone said super dungeons, also called mega dungeon, the ecology of a dungeon, in a Polyhedron article coined by Mark Smith.
Oh, very cool.
So that's kind of interesting. So it's a relatively new term, right? Mega dungeon, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you for looking that up, Carl. I didn't realize it was that new. One thing I'll mention though,
the concept is not new, but the term.
Right, the term. Yeah, exactly, the term. One thing I'll mention, Daniel's talking about the underworld, which you'll see in articles and all, is the mythic underworld, the idea of the changing dungeon. That also goes back to volume 3 of OD&D, where it talks.
Oh, very cool.
DM advice in there is to change the dungeon up when the players come back, move rooms around, things like that. So that goes back to the very earliest days of the hobby, the idea of the dungeon changing and not being a static place, even the rooms not being a static thing.
Right.
So just to throw that out there. Go ahead, Daniel.
See, I raised my hand that time.
That is great.
And I think that maybe is something that has been lost. And that's the only reason why I wanted to kind of put that out there, is I think that people start thinking, man, I'm going to run a mega dungeon campaign. So I'm just going to make a huge dungeon that all makes sense. This was some temple and everything's going to be the same. It's all going to be based on this religion. It's all going to have undead. It's all going to have demons, whatever it is. And you make this huge dungeon of hundreds and hundreds of rooms. And what you get is, in my experience, bored players. Because I feel like a mega dungeon is your campaign, like Todd said, which means that it needs to change and shift depending on what players want to do. So as they're changing in the play style and you feed into your players what they like, what they enjoy, you give more of that. The dungeon can change and evolve to do the things they want to do. And also the things you want to throw at them, just to kind of throw them off base.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a great point. So if somebody wants to build a mega dungeon, let's talk, or a dungeon, either one, doesn't matter. But if they want to look at these things, what kind of tools and philosophy? So we've talked a little bit about philosophy already, right? We talked about the idea the dungeon might be a more kind of one, if we're going to use themes, kind of a one theme thing, where a mega dungeon is going to be mixed themes and different things. Because Daniel's right. I mean, if you're just going in, all you're doing is going into Barrow Maze day after day after day for 2 years, it gets kind of samey, right? So which Barrow Maze has things to mitigate that in the book. When you read the book, he gives you ways around that. You can do a venturing away from the Barrow Maze. You have all kinds of other options, so it doesn't have to be samey. But if all you did every adventure, every session was stand up, okay, we're going to break into this barrow today, it would, that would start to get a little bit old.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good point too, because when you think about the original campaigns as they envisioned it, whether or not people actually played this way, they would go into the mega dungeons or the dungeon, whatever we call it, to get the treasure, and then they would do stuff with it, right? So they would do other adventures. They'd go out in the wilderness. That's why we have different parts of the book, right? You get all this gold. Now you form a party together. You're going to go clear an area of the wilderness. You find another dungeon or a small area that you clear. So, right, you shouldn't just be going each day into the dungeon like it's a job at a factory. That would probably become quite tedious no matter what the dungeon was.
Sure.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I guess you have to see how your players, how the players and their ideas evolve, right, during the play. Because some players love that. They're like, oh, we want to go to the Barrow Maze every day and take our crowbars and try to break in. Then they're gonna eventually find that you can't just take crowbars and hammers to break in. You're gonna need contraptions, pulleys, and all that kind of stuff. And then it takes longer. And then what I like is that from a Barrow Maze is that that just doesn't happen in space, right? So Dr. Gillespie has put things in place where shit happens if you stay too long. For example, it creates you can't always sneak in to break into the Barrow Maze, and then that changes the dynamic too, right? Then all of a sudden you have people following you or random encounters because you're making so much noise, and then the landscape will change too, right? So on top of all the campaign and stuff that's going on outside of the Barrow Maze, I think even at the site, things will change. So I think that I think is a good consideration is change, right? So yes, you're going to have the conceit is that you have this one place that players are going to go to with their characters back and forth, but there has to be some sort of, I feel like, some evolution that, as as Daniel stated, kind of hopefully matches with what the players want to do, right? So that it is dynamic and the players do have fun and the GM has fun, because it is kind of samey for the GM too, to always have to like be flipping through and looking for what room are we, where are we, and so I think change is a consideration if we're making a mega dungeon, because you want it to be a sustainable campaign, right? It's not a mini campaign. It's like you're thinking long term.
Yeah, 100%. And I think too, which is going to come into, I have already read Jason's mind. But the other thing too, what Barrow Maze does well is there's multiple entrances, right? So you can figure out once you've gone to a certain part, you don't always have to get in, right? Because again, if this is would be a bad design of a dungeon would be you come in the first floor and every single time you have to keep going through. I guess the example I will give, which I do not like, is Tucker's Kobold, which everybody loves to talk about. how that they need to make this challenge in the first level of the dungeon for the high level party because they got through the kobolds too easy. Well, they shouldn't be going through the first level of the dungeon if they're 8th level. There should be other entrances, and you should be able to get deeper into a mega dungeon without going through all the same stuff over and over again.
Yeah, for any listeners that aren't familiar, give a quick breakdown on Tucker's Kobolds.
Me? Okay. The wrong
or
person who
whoever, it
doesn't
doesn't
like
matter.
it.
I mean,
So the idea of Tucker's Cobalt is that, I mean, the thought of the idea of it, right? So I'll give the proper idea, but what I don't like is how people think of it. I think the idea of the thing is that you've got this high level party and they can just wipe out easy small monsters. So it doesn't become a challenge for them anymore. So this person tells this story, I think it was in a Dragon magazine, about how this one DM made these kobolds like little like ninja or like, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, green berets. They were like digging holes and using bombs and they killing all the stuff and making it super hard for these 8th or 9th level characters to get past these super easy monsters. And the idea of this, I think, is supposed to be creative with how you use monsters. But what people take it as is make every monster super crazy deadly so that even high level parties can't get past them. And I don't like that. I personally, if you're 8th level, kobolds should be running from you. There should not be, these Turkish kobolds should not even be an issue. That's besides the point. But in the case of a dungeon, I think you just need more entrances, right? If that's a kobold layer, and first of all, if you went through there and cleared out 50 kobolds, there wouldn't be 100 the next time. They would leave. I mean, that makes more sense to me than this like crazy, unless they're defending something really powerful, which is a whole other thing, right? But I think, like I said, like Barrow-Maze, for instance, there's multiple entrances. So you can get, once you get to a deeper part, or well, it's, you know, it's flat, but once you get to a higher level part, you can get back to that higher level part without going into the low levels if you want, for the most part. I mean, I've never run Barrow-Maze fully. I've used some of the barrows and I have the Barrow-Maze book, so I've read it. But that's how I look at it. You can get in different parts of it. Maybe Carl, if you've run it or played it, or Jason or Todd, I guess, then you could tell me if that's not true. But it seems like you can get in different parts of it.
Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, you can. I haven't played it, but I read through it on the channel not that long ago. And that's one of the kind of interesting parts about it, is how it's all horizontally spaced. So you don't have that concept of having to go down through multiple levels to get where you can. You just have to figure out, once you figure out, I guess, the geometry of the place, you recognize how it's laid out, you can kind of find where you want to enter. The Tucker's Kobolds thing is interesting because I never actually thought it was that exactly what Daniel said. I don't know if I just, because, you know, you read, I mean, I remember reading it, the original thing, and you read all the different out. I just thought it was about, like what Daniel kind of said about just making monsters dangerous. I didn't realize that they were doing it for a high level party moving through a lower level space. I mean, I think like what Daniel says is, I agree with, you know, and maybe just to bring this back to kind of dungeons, is someone actually pointed out in the comments in the video that I posted earlier that their kind of view, part of their view of MegaDungeons was having different entrances, like having multiple factions and different entrances, presumably leading to different areas, so that you're not having to go down to go through every level to get somewhere, that you can bypass and go down. I know Gygax talked about that in his original wisdom about dungeons, is having those multiple locations. And I think it is something that has tended to be lost with maybe modern dungeon design, is they tend to have just kind of the one entrance, and they don't, I'm not sure what the reason is for that. I mean, I can imagine maybe a couple of reasons. One, this concept of bypassing content. Do you want the party to be able to zip down to the 5th level? You want them to work their way through. And I think not even from a designer standpoint, but I'm sure from a GM standpoint, you're saying, look, I got this dungeon. I don't want them to be able to zip line down to the 5th level of the dungeon and kill everything. And especially when you're playing modern D&D, that's all around balance, right? That's a real concern. If you're afraid that your party is going to get overmatched because they went down the wrong level of the dungeon where they're supposed to be 2 levels stronger than they are right now, then it's not just a kind of, oh, well, like, no, this is something to avoid. Whereas I think classically we looked at it as saying, well, you take your chances, and you understand if you're going down to a level of the dungeon that's basically above your pay grade, then, you know, you get that risk reward, but part of that is the chance you're just going to get obliterated in the first room or corridor or wherever.
Yeah, so I agree, as always, because we talked about this actually in the live stream before about telegraphing, right? I think the key there is, like, you don't want to take your party, let's say, that's been playing 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, where everything's level based and they understand that, okay, this is a challenge we can overcome, and then suddenly put the set of stairs in front of them that goes down 4 levels where they're going to get their butts kicked. Like, that is super important. Obviously, it comes down to what I don't know, what I outside play talks, meta talks, whatever you want to say. Like, I mean, I will literally say that to my group and be like, you realize you're going 3 levels down in the dungeon. I mean, I'll just point that out if they don't know it, because I think that's only fair. They should know that. That's a conceit of the game, is that the deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. But they may not get that if they're not used to playing that style of game.
Definitely. And so that's definitely a talk you need to have, because the players that are used to balanced encounters and all that, the kind of dungeon design we're talking about will definitely throw them for a loop. One resource I'm going to throw out here really quickly, obviously you can read the old books. You can get the old books for very cheaply. The PDFs, the OD&D, the original Dungeons and Dragons, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. There's also, for free, everybody loves free, on the internet, there'll be a link in the show notes. You can go to the Alexandrian, and there's a very, I'd have to count, which would require more, but there's more parts of this article than I have fingers on my hand. There's an article called Jack Wayne the Dungeon, which of course goes off a famous dungeon designer which she's still around, Janelle Jackways, and she did a lot of stuff for now I'm brain farting, Judges Guild, including we mentioned
Judges Guild.
Gracia. Yep.
Right.
And so, but this talks about some of the design aspects that Jackway used in a lot of dungeons, things like multiple entrances and secret unusual paths, sub-levels, divided levels, nested dungeons, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, I'll put a link to this multi-part article.
That's a great idea.
These divining philosophies in there. And
yeah,
so you guys,
I think that's another. Yeah, I guess in considering our dungeon design, right? That is a consideration. Are we going to make it harder the deeper you go, or, for example, I threw out the example of Undermountain. I mean, it's dangerous from the get-go, right? You don't know what. I mean, in Undermountain, there were tables where you could, it was very random, and even on the first level of the dungeon, it could still be very deadly to a lower level party, right? I mean, I guess some of it is like a lot of this has been, trapezed through time and time again, so there's not really much there. But if you take a wrong turn, you're going to run into something that'll just, wipe out your whole party, right? So I guess that's another consideration, and I guess that goes with Barrow Maze too, right? Since it's not like a top down. The deeper you go, it's more dangerous. It's like depending on what you find down there, or what turn you take, it can become deadly very quickly, right? Because there are sections that are for quote unquote higher level, but as a low level group, you could accidentally run into that, right? So I guess that is another consideration as we design our MegaDungeon. Are we going to use that classic conceit that the deeper you go, the more deadly it gets, or is that not the case, right? I just want to throw that out there.
Daniel?
Cool. All right. So 2 things, because this is good. I actually ran at Gen Con a Janelle Jaquays dungeon, an early one, and 100% it does that. In fact, it's funny because if you follow a path, if you knew the dungeon, you could literally get from the beginning to the massive treasure with avoiding almost every combat. It's really, really interesting. And then if you go, quote, the wrong way, your party will be wiped out almost certainly. Like, it's very, very tough. So it's really interesting how she does that with her design. But to Carl's point, I haven't seen that adventure, but even in, like, I'm looking at the OSE, which unfortunately doesn't list love the way this is set up. It doesn't list the hit dice of things. But even with OSE, or basic expert, if you look at the first level dungeon monsters, you have things like lizard gecko, and I'm pretty sure those are 2 or 3 hit die, right? You've got green slime, which can kill you immediately. Fire beetles are pretty tough. So you've got things, spider crabs. So you do have things even on the first level. If I had my actual basic book, I could see their hit dice, but I'm pretty sure that snake cobra can kill you with the saber die poison. So I don't think that the first level should be a cakewalk. But and then plus, if you look at OD&D, which of course I don't have the book in front of me, when you roll on the monster table, if you roll like a 6 or something, you roll on the next level up, and then you keep doing that. So you could end up with a really powerful monster. So that's probably what they were doing there too as well. But I think the majority of monsters, to answer your question, I think the majority of things on the first level of the dungeon should be survivable for a low level party, so that they can go in, dip their foot in, come back out if they see something more deadly. That's how I would generally set up. In fact, the mega dungeon I was building, my entire first level is almost entirely traps, and most of them aren't deadly. So it's like a lot of wandering around, getting a feel for the dungeon before you're like going to run into a room full of ogres, let's say. They're just sitting there in stasis.
I actually have my basic book here in front of me, and if you end up on the first level, and so you're rolling for wandering monsters, and you don't get one of the rolls that tells you to go up a level, the most hit dice of a monster is the gecko, which is 3+1 hit dice. But you have at least a couple of them that need special weapons to hit: surges, killer bees, green slimes, and then some of them you have some poison. So it's definitely doable, right? But it feeds into those kind of, I mean, those OSR kind of plays. You're gonna have to be smart. You're gonna have to not run into every fight. You're gonna have to kind of pick and choose what you're going to do. I always feel like, is just to keep wrapping it back to kind of dungeon design, is I really like what Daniel mentioned about the Janelle Jaquaiz's dungeon, is that you could be that kind of cleverness, that kind of smartness. You can figure out stuff, you can kind of poke and prod it, and maybe you can find that great way through where you can avoid everything, or you can ally yourself with different factions to help you avoid stuff, or you can really do a lot of stuff, and it's not just this kind of corridor of monsters. Even if you end up having, sure, you can go different directions, but if your choices and all that stuff is still just, well, I can fight group of monsters A, or I can fight group of monsters B, well, okay, you have a choice, but does it really matter that much? But if taking those choices really has meaning in terms of things you can avoid, maybe finding stuff you couldn't find before, making friends, or finding other entrances or exits, or all that kind of fun stuff. And that's really what makes it an interesting place that will support playing it multiple times through. Like, I don't need to, if it's dungeons, just go kill some goblins. Do it once, great, that's fine. I'm not going to want to go back. If it's just, what are you going to go back in there? Oh, kill more goblins. But if these different paths actually have different things to them, going back to kind of the thematic, even within a theme, different kind of sub themes, right? You could have a temple complex, but the temple complex has a necropolis. It has, these holy rooms. Maybe it has altar rooms for prayer. All these different things can have different elements in them. Then it really engages me as a player that maybe I want to check out. If I've gone into one area, then, let me check out that other one. And that's kind of what we want to engender, right? With these dungeons, is we want players to be interested in continually pursuing or going through and just, finding out all the secrets that the dungeons offer.
Right. So just real quickly, and the interesting thing is, we talk about these different levels and way to skip levels and all this. This predates D&D. When you look at the dungeon board game, which predates D&D, Bagherty's Dungeon, you have the ability to skip down to deeper levels in that board game. But let's switch a little bit to, we're talking about MegaDungeon, so let's talk about that for a minute with faction play, because I think with faction play we expect factions in MegaDungeons, right? As some sort or another, because that's going to keep it interesting.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Inadvertently, we did not prepare or plan this, but it's a great segue because I'm inadvertently running B4 the Lost City, which I would consider a mega dungeon. It's got 100 rooms and a city underground city attached to it, and the expansion that they've done. So the original concept of it, what I loved, the original Moldway concept, what he effectively did have, like, this is the beginning of your mega dungeon, and here is an outline for the rest of it, right? He just had, as Daniel and Todd had talked about earlier, there's just 5 works in this room, but I don't have a story behind it. You get to make it up as a GM, and actually, Moldway kind of states that in his product, so in the original product. But what I love about it is, like you guys were saying, I mean, there are tricks to the dungeon, and you could just run it as like a temple, pyramid clearing, circle, spiral down, but you probably are going to get wrecked by a lot of the deadly creatures and encounters and traps in there. And what Moldway introduced into this game, into the Lost City, was this faction play, right? There's something weird going on. The players don't know quite what, and they learn about it, or they don't. Right, it's a choice. That's what I like about that. And they can interact with the various factions that they can encounter, which makes things a lot easier. They can gain like a stable of henchmen, through the faction play, and learn about what the hell is going on in this weird pyramid in the desert. Right, that makes absolutely no sense. except it is its own little ecology, which I think is great. It's a great testament to Molde's design and his philosophy in creating this adventure campaign site, right? So that's really what it is. It was, I think it was it was definitely his intention was, this is you find this place in the desert and lost in the desert, you come upon it and it becomes your campaign, which I think is pretty cool. In contrast to that, and I think what I like is in B4, there's a lot of options, and the GM can go in very different directions depending on how the players react, or even from a reaction rule, right? So it's like that's a key feature in BX play is the reaction role. So if you come across these factions and you come across you get a bad impression with them, well, it's going to be a fight, and I love that, the randomness about it, right? I do think when we design our dungeon, we should keep whatever I feel like we'll make it like system generic, but we should keep that sort of idea that it's not, as little as possible a linear path. In contrast to that, while I'm really enjoying running Abomination Vaults for Pathfinder 2, it is like there's a story, and the players have to buy into the story hook, right? This ancient enemy has arisen, and you have to travel down the dungeon to destroy it and figure out how to stop its machinations, right? So, and the players hopefully buy in to why they want to do this, right? But it's and I would say, unfortunately, but if some players do like that story hook to follow, but unfortunately, that's the adventure path, right? And that leaves not as much, I would say, input to the GM in compared to Lost City, which I'm really enjoying. So.
Well, I think one of the things you can do when you have your dungeon or mega dungeon, if it's dynamic and it has a lot of these fertile ground for you as a GM, you can create your adventure hooks that you want to, right? Because there's no reason why you couldn't have some great evil that's at the bottom of the Lost City. And so the party, instead of having them, I think by default, I think it's just a sandstorm and they end up at the Lost City kind of thing. You're running for shelter and you get to the pyramid or the town that's on the outside of the pyramid, whatever. Daniel says no spoilers for the 40-year-old module. But you could easily change that to
the young kids that have more issue.
That's true. But you could easily change that to finding it, right? To actually seeking out the Lost City.
Right, you could. Yeah, you could definitely do that. Yeah, the conceit is that.
Go ahead.
No, so yeah, the way the dungeon starts is that by default, you are lost in a sandstorm and you come upon it. But you're right, you could, depending on your campaign and what the play style is for your player characters. What if they have a grand backstory that they're the scion of a lost civilization? Well, then there's your lost civilization. You can have them find out about this and travel through the desert to find this location, right? So
that'd be pretty awesome, actually. They think it still exists because it's like 1,000-year-old civilization, and then they show up and it's all wiped out. That's pretty awesome as well. That's Lost City is one of my favorite modules of all time. So I think it's a great example of the faction play that you can do in a mega dungeon. And it's not even weird. I mean, and now I'm spoiling, but like the factions are primarily human. So it's not even like, because a lot of times people think, well, the goblins hate the orcs or whatever. Right. They're kind of like but like, it's not like the trolls don't like the bugbears. It's like literally like different types of people on some level. For the most part, I mean, again, no spoilers.
Well, I'll put a note on there, the spoilers for Lost City.
Yeah, only because I think Crossart say Goodman Games has re-released it. And I'm quite sure that a lot of people picking up like 5e might be playing this for the first time.
Right.
Well, I think what I like about the 5e version is they give you ideas. I mean, you don't have to. You can or cannot follow like the fill-ins that they gave, from the original Molde product, but they give you ideas to do so. So like, since I'm running it for BX OSE, then I can I might use this or I might not, or I'll change things around, as I need to, because I'm not using like the 5e rule set. So I'm not just going to plug and play. But the outline is there, and that's what I love about it. And I think what I like about it too is that there's a mystery, and the characters can try to piece it together, but it's not like force. I don't feel it's force fed to you, honestly, right? It's not force fed to you.
Right.
Yep, the players discover it, as opposed to, I think, in more modern games, and maybe this is just my yellow color. I don't know. I guess what's the opposite of rose colored glasses? I don't know.
Cynical.
My cynically mirror bladed glasses that I think in the more modern games they kind of ram down your throat the path you should go on, right? And that's why I appreciate like Daniel and Todd were saying the Lost City a lot. And it's a new discovery to me because I don't remember getting it way back. I did have a B2 and I think the Palace of the Silver Princess and stuff like that. But I guess I don't know. Somehow I guess I know why, because remember Basic was the kiddies game and AD&D was the adult version. So that's why.
It's true. Yeah.
I mean, that was our. I don't know if that was intentionally advertised as that way, but it felt like that.
Oh, I think it was definitely advertised that way. I think I've just. Yeah. I mean, everyone I've talked to anecdotally, or most people, had that same thing where we ended up either switching or mixing them in because it felt like, oh, we've played now, so we should be advanced. I was going to say on the Lost City, just an interesting thing is one thing they do that kind of changes it up is you don't have your settlement to go back to, right? You end up at the outskirts of that Lost City and you have to go down because there's nothing back out there but desert. And it's made fairly clear that there's nothing out for you out in that desert but kind of death. So you have to keep going down. And you have to, it is interesting because it pushes you to figure out, well, we need to find a new home base, somewhere you can resupply, which then pushes you towards interacting with factions other than killing them, because you're trying to get, well, where are we going to buy goods from? Where are we going to get stuff? We need a place to
spend
sleep,
all our
money.
Yeah.
Spend all this money we're getting. But it's interesting how even then they kind of flip the script, because I would say the kind of classic dungeon design, right? It's something like Keep on the Borderlands, where you have a settlement and then you have the dungeon. And you go to the dungeon, you come back to the settlement, you kind of go back and forth. And here they're like, nope, you're going to have to find, I mean, really the whole thing is you're going to have to dig down to the Lost City to find the settlement that you can stay at, because otherwise you're just going to get ground up. Unless, of course, you even, with the factions, you're going to have to find it. So it was really interesting how they give you that push, which pushes you towards discovery too, right? Because it's not as easy as just wandering around. It's like, no, we need to find specific things. We need to talk to people. We need to make friends. We need to do all these things. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it with every dungeon, but that one's a good one for that, because they kind of flip the script around. I mean, it's almost like the settlement's inside the dungeon. You got to go to the bottom of the dungeon and there's your settlement. So it's really interesting how that inversion worked in that module.
Yeah, I guess we didn't intend to make this a treatise on the B4 the Lost City by Tom Rolday, but
it's a good example.
It's a great example. It's a great example. Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about if we're going to design our own. Let's segue a little bit here. If we're going to design our own, what kind of tools do we want to look at? We've talked about OD&D, the original white box set. We've talked about the AD&D first edition Dungeon Master Guide a little bit, which honestly you could build everything out of that. It's not the most user-friendly thing, but it's got a lot of stuff in there. But what other tools are out there? I guess I'll throw one out that's just been republished, and if you back the Kickstarter, should be delivered next month. Matt Finch's Tome of Adventure Design, which is an amazing resource. It has, I don't know, like 100 pages on building the dungeons, and I mean it's a huge resource for building this stuff. What resources
That's a great book.
Do you guys use when you're building these? Let's start with Todd.
Oh wow, on me. Well,
or dungeons or mega dungeons, doesn't matter. But if you're going to design it, what resources do
you have all those books behind you?
I know. Let me grab one. I think in the basic expert has some of the tables, same stuff. Then I think it's what B1 in Search of Unknown, I think, has that same. It's on a much smaller scale than Lost City, but it's also a great big prompt to you of like, hey, here, take this skeleton and let's walk you through filling out your dungeon. I mean, I'm always one that likes to go and look at other dungeons. Kind of, what do they do? What do they do that I like? What do they do that I don't like? So I'll look at something like Keep on the Borderlands. What do I like about the caves? I like all the factions. I like the kind of. I mean, we talked about kind of the open-ended nature, right? The Caves of Chaos is a great example because there's I don't know how many different cave entrances. I think depending on how high you decide to clamber up the side of the cliffs to try to get into will kind of dictate somewhat. I think the easier ones tend to be on the ground floor and the harder stuff is towards the top. So it's almost even in that early thing, kind of a bit of an inversion of the classic Greyhawk Castle, where the stuff isn't about how deep you go. It's almost that it's kind of how high you go or how close you get towards the inner sanctum of the temple. So I tend to kind of grab if I have a theme in mind, I'll try to look at stuff like, oh yeah, I want to do it. I want to do the kind of pyramid thing. So I'll go grab B4. Oh, Cult of the Reptile God. I think is that the one that's got kind of the whole city that's sort of which one is it that's got, it's not the Lost City, but it's another one that has basically a kind of a walled city that's out in the middle of the jungle. Is that against the Cult of the Reptile God, or is it a different? Forget
that's the one with the town, and then they have to go out into the swamp eventually.
Yeah.
Spoilers.
No,
Well,
you're right. It's
go ahead.
I won the Lost City.
Okay, is that? Yeah, I mean, look, that's the if that's spoiling you, you're in a settlement and you're eventually going to have to leave to go to somewhere dangerous. We're spoiling everything.
Very many
bitching about that module. Everybody knows about that module anyways because Matt Colville did a video and it has like a gazillion hits on it.
Oh,
but,
really?
Which one is that?
The cult of the reptile against the Cult of the Reptile God.
Yeah, N1.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's got kind of a cool like sandboxy sort of city with the thing you can go and check out. So I'll kind of look for what fits. Go ahead.
My favorite part about that module is is the name, and it's like plastered across the front. So like you bring it into your group to play, it's like, I have a new adventure to play. You're going into this peaceful city, and you put the map up. It says against the Cult of the Reptile Gods, right? Oh yeah,
they didn't bury the lead on that one.
Exactly. So I forgot. So Tom was talking about the Caves of Chaos, which I think is interesting, but it's true that you don't go down, but you do go deeper, right? Because the caves near when you enter into the space are the easy caves, if you will, right? And then the deeper you go in. So again, a dungeon master, if the party's like, we're going to go all the ways to the back because we're first level and we're just want to die, you could easily have the kobolds like at the edge of their cave and see them. I mean, you could certainly make it so that they don't do that if you don't, telegraph ahead of time, which you should, that the closer caves are the ones you want to, bar room or whatever.
Yeah, first level, you don't want to just enter the Minotaur cave, right?
Exactly. You don't want to fight a Minotaur first level. But I was going to say one thing that I pulled out when we were talking about this, I think is really interesting. So, because I want to discuss maps a little bit, because when you look at like the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, like Jason's talking about, or Strategic Review, or a fifth edition even, they've got like a thing where you can roll randomly to create a map if you don't want to draw one yourself. There's also a million map resources out there. And then this product is pretty cool, which is called Into the Weird and Wild, although it's made for outside, but it uses something I've seen other things use this as well, where you basically just drop dice onto an area. And then the dice represent the type of room, as it would be in this case it is. But then to make it even more interesting is it also has a table for which ways to get there. So it's like abstracted. So it'll be like, here's a room over here. I mean, they're outside, so it might be a temple. And then to get from the temple to the grass clearing, there's a dangerous path. I air quote a lot. Dangerous path. So then you would decide what's a dangerous path. What does that mean? So I wonder, like, do you guys ever do dungeons where you don't actually, like a point crawl dungeon, as opposed to one where you're actually like drawing corridors and stuff? Because I think that's fairly common in like 5-room dungeons, but I'm curious if people do that for like bigger dungeons.
That's a good question. If we're talking about like I've done that before with D&D, it seems like you have like these hard, rooms that are defined, right? This actually mapped out. But there's in other games that I've played or run, it becomes like a flow chart. I think Kevin Crawford has really been really great about that. I think it was in in Other Dust, he might have introduced something like that where there's this massive ruined complex, but we're not going to map out the whole space. Here is a flow chart of how different areas would be when you encounter something interesting. And I think I feel like Mutant Year Zero does something similar to that, where I've seen. But with that resource that you reminded me about the map building, and it kind of ties in with this side discussion here about, are we actually using a graph paper and putting down the grid for all the maps? Reminds me of a product that you could use, and you could use it for not its intended purpose. It's a product for Numenera. They came out with this this MegaDungeon mega location called Jade Colossus, and it has a really nice map, random map development as you. And in fact, it's intended so that it's intended. Yep, Maddie likes it, I guess. That's intended that you use it during play, right? So not even the GM knows what's going to come next. So it's that easy to go through, and I've done it before, where you just gotta roll randomly, and there's a corridor, there's a chamber at the end of the corridor or not, and what's in the what might be in the chamber. Here's some ideas. So I think Jade Colossus could be a good resource to repurpose for our mega dungeon potentially, and get an idea of like what the outline of the dungeon might be. And then if you wanted to, you could either you could define it, specifically, like map out the actual rooms, or just keep it vague, keep it that sort of flowchart / template where you go through quarters until something interesting occurs.
Yeah, well, I think that brings up a great point, that one thing you can do that's very easy to do, and if you're time crunched or you just don't want to do all this, you can just look online, or you can take existing products that you have and just plug them, play them together, right? You'll have to come up with your faction stuff, but if you don't want to draw maps, you can easily grab dungeons from tons of different products and slap them together to use for this, if you don't want to draw stuff out, or if you have something you want to borrow from something interesting. So existing products, existing modules are definitely, or like we had mentioned in the pre-discussion chat, I don't think we mentioned one here yet, but like the Donjon dungeon generator, right? So things like that. I mean, these are more for your littler dungeons, but even in your mega dungeons, if you need a side area, you could just grab something from an existing product to plug in there instead of building it out yourself. Now, you're going to want to theme it a little bit if you have if that's a factioned area, the dungeon, you want it to fit with that faction, and you might have to think about maybe the monsters or treasure that are in there. But as far as maps and all, you don't necessarily have to draw any maps if you're willing to just plug and play from existing ones that are out there, if maps aren't your thing. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. I wonder too, I guess this kind of comes into the question of mapping and how important that is. And going back to my mega dungeon versus dungeon, thought process, I think in a mega dungeon, you want people to map. I know that some people don't like to map, but I feel like because the dungeon itself is a puzzle, the mapping becomes really important. You want to notice that something's changed because things change, right? You want to notice there's a new passageway here. And if you are the DM and you just say, well, you're traveling down the way you normally come and there's a new passage, then what are the players going to do? They're going to go there because they feel like you're coaxing them in that direction. But if you just describe the hallway, you go, yeah, you head 50 feet down and then there's a passageway to the right, then it travels 50 feet more, and the mapper's going to go, hold on, what? There's no map, there's no hallway there. Is that new? Well, you investigate it. Oh, yeah, it looks like a different kind of stone. Now all of a sudden they're intrigued and they could go or not go. And you're not necessarily saying, yeah, he'll go here. Here's the adventure, which is cool. But I feel like in a dungeon, they're not going to explore again. How relevant is it to map? I mean, unless you just enjoy doing that.
Well, it depends what you're doing, right? I mean, if you're doing if you're doing a virtual tabletop where you're showing them the map, then obviously mapping's not nearly as important. If you're doing theater of the mind, or they're relying only on the map they have that they've drawn in front of them, it becomes more important, especially if they're trying to escape the dungeon because somebody's chasing them out. Then knowing the right way to turn might be important. But it depends on your style of game, I guess. Is your style of game you get to the end of that dungeon and okay, well, so you go back town and you don't play them walking out of the dungeon, or do you make them backtrack through? So I guess
it depends on your GM style and how the players would respond to that, right? So depending even on how much time you have left in the session, I don't need you to tell me exactly how you backtrack. Let's just roll a couple times for random encounters and then just get back to town or safe space or whatever. Or if you have, if that is part of it, and some players you'd be surprised. I mean, some players really get into that. Actually, why wouldn't we be surprised? We've been playing for so long. There's all sorts of players, right? Some players surprisingly love space trucking, right? They love the trade stuff in Traveler or in any game, where you do trade stuff, the boat travel trade stuff, on the river. But so some players love that mapping. I want my map to be so damn accurate that yes, I can describe how we're getting back. And kudos to me and the party, right? So I guess it really depends, right? That's how I would approach it.
Go ahead.
I think part of the West Marches deal, right? Was it West Marches deal? This concept of, and I think really what the kind of old school sort of group play was, you ended up back in town by hook or by crook. That way everybody could reorganize from the next expedition. And I don't know how they did it back in the day, If they just how Gygax or those guys ran it early on. I know the West Marches, they had that table. I think you could roll some kind of check, or they roll on some table, whether you drop stuff, got hurt, or something happened, which I think a lot of modern players might feel like is unfair. But I suppose the flip side is that make sure you get back to town. Like that, you don't want to roll on the table, then make sure you kind of, you get out. But I think it is interesting, that concept of, and we could probably get into this too, that this idea of the dungeon level, which I think if you go back and you look at the older modules, their dungeon levels were kind of designed to kind of have sort of a sweet spot of how much you could monkey with it and then get back in some kind of, if you kind of followed their sort of session time guidelines, you could kind of run through a level and then get back to town. And that's kind of how they basically, how they decided how much was a level, right? It was kind of how much is basically one session, at least you can move around and then head back. And I don't know how that would equate now. Everyone plays, like, my sessions are really short, so I don't think I could roll with that. I mean, my party would constantly be rolling on that West Marches table if we had to do that. But I think if you can find I don't know what the sweet spot is for time to rooms, but I think it's something to think about when we're looking at thinking about, I guess, how big our level should be, like how much should it be in a level. I think that's a nice guideline, is what can a reasonable party in a reasonable amount of time get through in a session.
Yeah, and I think we're going to throw it to Daniel in a second. It really also depends on the game you're playing. If you're playing Holmes D&D, you don't take your spell book into dungeon, period. I mean, it's right there in the rule book. So if you don't go back, you're not rememorizing spells. So you're going to be in trouble. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I think that's super interesting. I'm going to comment on that first, because that's really great. You see in some of these older editions where they talk about memorizing spells for the adventure. Mm-hmm. And that's because the conceit is, I say, that the adventure is one session. You go in, you do your thing, you leave. And some people don't think of it that way, because when you're talking experience points, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think that's really interesting. But I was going to say, for the way I handle mapping in bigger dungeons is, when they're coming in, they're rewarded if they have the map, because they can move faster. Because when they just go, we go down the hallway, we go left, we go whatever. When they're leaving, if they have a map, then I just basically say, you know how to get out. I mean, there's no sense in role playing that out. I know you mapped it. But you can move at your maximum speed, instead of the 120 feet per 10 minutes, right? It's like you can move at your combat speed, basically, and just get out of this dungeon. And then that really reduces the amount of wandering monsters. This way, I am rewarding the players for what I consider good play in those kind of things, as opposed to being punitive, going, well, we're out of time, roll on this table, you're probably dead. I find that to be really just a bad way. I mean, sorry, I know there's no good bad, but I don't feel like making players roll on something because they were enjoying the game too long that they didn't get out to be a good baseline for what you want people to do.
Well, yeah, and that's definitely going to be a GM style and a table style and something to discuss, with the group. This is how we're going to, because to pop out that table in the group without them even knowing that that's an option is kind of harsh. So they should know that's a possibility ahead of time.
I mean, even if you know that is a possibility ahead of time, then what are you going to do as a player? You're going to be, the session's 4 hours. So how much time do we have? How much time do we have? And you're going to constantly be thinking about it. So I just don't find that to be a good idea. I have not done it, so I can't say maybe it's the best thing in the world in play. But I find that sometimes these ideas that people blog about and stuff maybe aren't as play tested as we'd like them to be.
Yeah.
Or tables just like that stuff. I mean, I've played with groups where they don't, like, every session they have new characters because they're just like, well, what? It's almost the end of the session. I run into the room and die. It's like they just don't care. But that's not the group that I like to stick around with. And that's certainly not one for a long-term campaign, in my opinion, as far as a play style.
Right. So we're wrapping up on our time here. I want to throw out a couple more tools here, and then maybe if you guys have some other tools and some final
Did we
thoughts.
talk about 80 tools? We're like, completely went off.
Yeah, well, I've thrown out a couple here. The Tome of Adventure Design.
Tome of Adventure Design.
The other thing I'm going to mention here. Yep, yeah. Carl said the J Colossus. I'm going to mention the old school stuff. So if you go through and you go and drive through RPG, you can find the various old school products by Kent David Kelly, and there's a ton of them, and they're pretty cheap, but they're very in depth. There's a dungeon generator that's very, very in depth. There's a classic dungeon design guide that even has an example of building out a MegaDungeon in there. And these are fairly system neutral products to help you do that. So there's a lot of good products out there to help build if you're looking for tools. I mean, me personally, I just grabbed the DMG, but yeah. Like the Tomb of Adventure Design is a great thing. So let's
Yeah.
go into other tools or wrap up stuff, whatever. Daniel, go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to mention this because we actually were talking about this in the chat. So this book is actually constantly said it's not a very good book, but I'll mention it anyways, which is the Dungeon Master's Guide for the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. It has an entire section here on making a dungeon. It talks about the history of the dungeon, what might be in the dungeon, the types of dungeons they are. It has all the rules for rolling up random if you want to map it yourself. It's got contents, it's got smells, it's got all this stuff. So it is actually here in the most modern edition. If you are playing 5th edition and you have this DMG and you read like the first 5 pages, like I did when I first got it, and then put it on the shelf, maybe go a little deeper into like, I think it's chapter 5. It does actually have a pretty good amount of information on building your dungeon from scratch.
I want to hop in real quick. I've never read the I don't know the 5th edition books. I will mention one other thing really quickly about Tome of Adventure Design. I don't know if you guys have looked at the new one, but in the margin of every page, he has thematic things like descriptors, right?
Cool.
On every single page, there on the sidebar, there's thematic descriptors down there, and this is like a 500-page book. So just paging through, like you're looking for a descriptor, you just page through and just get these different descriptors to spur your memory or to spur your imagination or do whatever. It's really cool. So I mean,
I have the original. It's a great
grabbing.
resource.
Yeah. But I am hogging the time here. I don't want to do that.
No,
so let's go to.
I'll just since we're on me, let me just go through all of mine. That way, maybe that's just simpler. So we work. So if you just want the how to play solo basically and the stuff that's in the DMG in a more basic way, there's also the strategic review #1, which is out there. I don't think you can get that legally, but nobody's caring if you have strategic review. It's was like an in-house magazine. So if you find that from Googling, strategic review #1 has how to build it, like basically a solo adventure, but you can use that to build a dungeon. It's basically a stripped down version of what's in the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide. There is also a couple of websites. Jason mentioned Donjon. There's also I guess it's called Dungeon. That's from Morkborg. I wouldn't build a mega dungeon with this, but this thing is great if you want atmosphere. You press this button and it comes up starting it. A couple of like kind of encounters that are basically agnostic for the most part, like system agnostic. And you can press the different ones and it'll switch them until you get a combination you like. So I do that a lot when I'm doing just quick dungeons, like location dungeons as opposed to mega dungeon. And I think that's it. That's my list.
Okay. Well, real quick, because we've talked about a little bit. Axebane's deck of mini dungeons. Do you want to comment on that?
Axebane's deck of mini dungeons is pretty cool. So basically, you have 4 or 5 starting cards. You put them down. It's a deck of cards, and then you flip cards out until each one has like a different. It's like a geomorph basically, but they don't all link together. You put them where they need to go. All the cards will have stuff like if there's a monster on the card, it'll have a list of monsters by level. It'll have a treasure. So you've got like a whole, and they're really beautiful looking. So you can flip them out and create dungeons. I found that I generally get maybe 6-7 rooms before you get to a part where you can't add any more. So they don't make huge dungeons generally, but it's a great little resource. If solo play, it'd be really good. But I like it a lot. Axebane's deck of many dungeons. It is available as a PDF on drive-through, but if you want to buy it, you have to get it from their site. I think you can't get it in drive-through cards. You got to get it Axebane's own site.
Yeah, you go to the Game Crafter to get it. Yep.
Yeah, that I have the physical deck. It's really beautiful, so I recommend it.
Yeah, I'll have links to that in the show notes. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, one I kind of totally forgot about, but it's a really good book, and it actually has some of that, like what Daniel mentioned about using dice to generate dungeons. It's called Realm Fables: Diaries of Dungeon Design by Shield Ice Studio. If you check my channel, I did a read through of it a while back. It's available on drive through. I mean, it's got tons and tons and tons of things for generating different bits, dungeon dressing, all kinds of stuff. It was pretty wild how much stuff they squeezed into that book. A really good resource, and I'm pretty sure it's either completely system agnostic or it's kind of generic OSR. So really highly compatible with any system you'd want to use it with.
Nice. Any other tools or anything else you wanted to mention, Todd? Well, you have the mic.
Not that that one's the big one that comes to mind. I mean, there's lots of things out there. I think there's more things to shake a stick at. I tend to just kind of lean on, like I said, like the Shield Studios one is really good. I just mentioned, and then I really think look at the dungeons you like. You ran a dungeon, you really like it a lot. Try to think about what makes it tick. Steal steal from them, steal liberally from everybody, and then throw it together, and you got your own thing.
Definitely. Carl?
Yeah, I think I had mentioned the Jade Colossus just for map making. A Tome of Adventure design, like you had mentioned, it looks like it's amazing. And the PDF is great, and I can't wait till the hardcover. And I think, Daniel, you did mention the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, right, to create dungeons and dungeon advice. But I think when we were talking about online, it is a specific campaign, but it's the 13th Age Eyes of the Stone Thief. But it does have advice for handling a dungeon, a chart for configuring the levels, and there's an example of another mega adventure, mega dungeon with I guess in theory a twist. So I think it's a pretty good resource if you can get it as well. I know it's available on DriveThru, and they actually have a 5e conversion document too. Is written for 13th Age. I think that's it. And then, and like Todd said, I think just getting ideas from the history of the mega dungeons, although not called that, the history of the big dungeons that exist out there, and then the new incarnations that, for example, Greg Gillespie has created, Pharaoh Maze and the other ones.
Yeah, he's got a whole bunch, right? And then there's also Stonehell. It's another big one that people really like. I don't have that one.
Yeah.
By Mike Curtis. So I will say that, I guess there's a kind of final thing here when we're talking about looking at what's good about a dungeon or whatever. I think the most important thing, which is funny because we're talking about tools, but is to figure out why the player characters are there. That to me is the key to making the dungeon interesting, right? So whether it be they heard a rumor that there's some gem there, whether they're chasing after the missing, sheep, whether they, if it's D&D, you're supposed to go to the dungeon. I don't think any dungeon is going to be as interesting. So as much as I'm not one to say this is the mission, unless it's a one shot, you're just kind of doing it. I think having rumors, having reasons that point back to your dungeon will make the player characters or the players naturally want to go there. So if you have a set system where one player is a cleric and they're really searching for spells, let's say, and you play a game where they don't automatically get them, by putting rumors out there that, if you pray at this temple, the gods often, grant you spells. This is going to give them a reason to go there, so they know what they're looking for. They have a reason to go back in case they run into something deadly. And this will actually make the dungeon more alive. And that's kind of what I was talking about before, why I feel like a mega dungeon as a campaign is something that really need to build with your players, because you want it to lure them in. And that's kind of the generic mega dungeon advice that I would give there.
No, I think that's great advice. And any other, we're going to wrap this up. And then, folks, if you haven't gone to Todd's Express YouTube channel and watched part 2 of this already, then check that out. If you've already watched part 2, that's okay. But yeah, there'll be links to that in the show notes. But any final thoughts, Todd?
No, I think Daniel's thing was spot on, right? The interest level. Why are they there? And both what are they looking for, and also what sources of interest can you build within the dungeon to keep them seeking, looking, and exploring. And if that's true for a dungeon, then it's quadruply true for a mega dungeon.
Definitely. Carl, last thoughts?
No, I think we've said and given a lot of examples of things that we like and things that we do, and in our dungeon design and how to think about designing a mega dungeon. I think, that's about it.
Okay.
I think, honestly, I guess in conclusion, I think it is a very cool thing to couch your gaming campaign around. Is a dungeon, a mega dungeon? I think it's a single location. The players know where to go. They don't know what to expect, but they're not. It's contained, I guess, self-contained, not self-contained, but contained. So try it out if you haven't tried it. I think it's a great idea.
Yep, I would agree with that. So thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate your joining me today for this discussion. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in and joining us. And we'll be back to you next week. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
A nerd and cobra podcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the spinal tap straw. The all stars and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's playing teeth, or suicide your brain. What I mean is this machine's a freak, and from what I understand, don't look now, the Super Bowl is coming, and all that's left is crying and running. You can